We're going to transition right into our next session here, and the topic is about advanced threats and raising the bar on cyber defenses. For backdrop here, from ransomware to infected devices and assaults on critical infrastructure, organizations such as yours are increasingly encroached by advanced threats, threat actors, and security leaders such as yourselves are tasked with taking traditional cyber defenses to the next level to mitigate these emerging risks. So what are the defenses and strategies that are going to help you raise that bar? We're going to talk about mitigating advanced threats. We're going to talk about mitigating the security risks of IoT and whether outsourcing your security would make sense from a financial and resource perspective. I want to welcome three panelists to the stage. One is the CTO of Fidelis Security, Mr. Craig Harbour. Craig? All right, grab a seat. Next is the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer of the City of New York, Mr. Mike Cryer. Mike, pleased to meet you. And then finally, from Washington, D.C., Special Counsel with Cyber Data Privacy Practice Group from Cooley LLP, Mr. Randy Sabet. Randy, thank you very much. Gentlemen, please have a seat. Let's have a conversation. I'll come over here so I can be seen beyond obstructed view here. Gentlemen, let's just start with a quick round of introductions. Just give a sense of what you do in your roles today as it comes to relating to advanced threats. And Randy, let's start with you down there.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Randy Sabet from Cooley, as was mentioned by Tom. I am an attorney who deals with all of the risk and liability aspects of all the stuff that you all are doing. So as I like to say, I would much rather work with clients who are doing things proactively, trying to figure out what are the advanced threats, doing the right risk assessments, those sorts of things. Obviously, I wind up oftentimes dealing on the reactive side. But what's interesting to me, and I think we'll get into this in the midst of the discussion, is how the advanced threat actors are changing. I don't like to use the word sophisticated necessarily. It's more of a persistence issue and sort of a creativity issue. And one other sort of sidebar note, I was a former crypto engineer at NSA. In fact, Craig and I just realized that we have many, many people in common over the years because we have a common employer. And so I started on the technical side, and my soapbox here is if any of you all are interested in a legal career as a second or third career, come and talk to me afterwards because we don't have enough people in the legal field with your kind of knowledge.
Randy, they've got staffing issues already. You can't bring yours to the table here.
And I'll stop there and pass it back.
Mike?
I'm Mike Krieger, Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York, and I'm the Deputy Chief for Urban Technology, and Urban Technology is a division which focuses on all the emerging technologies, so Internet of Things, smart city cybersecurity, but it also includes critical infrastructure, and that includes the freshwater system, second largest in the world, that New York City runs. It includes the public safety answering centers, two of the largest in the country here in New York City, also includes election cybersecurity. So no small things there.
One of those is a department.
Yeah, so DEP runs the water system, and then also includes vulnerability management for the city, so understanding our vulnerability posture, and then most recently application security. So how do we secure and triage the 10,000 plus applications that the city runs to serve New Yorkers?
Excellent. Craig?
Yes, and good morning. My name is Craig Harbour. I'm the CTO of Fidelis Cybersecurity. In that role, actually, really looking at product strategy, looking at innovation. But as Randy mentioned, my career really started at NSA 33 years ago. So I have 33 years at NSA. Most of that time was working defensive capabilities, but some of that time was looking at offensive capabilities. I spent a year and a half in U.S. Cyber Command. So I have a kind of a unique perspective. I understand the role of both the attacker and the defender. And I'm trying to bring, I'll say, those capabilities to Fidelis to start to think about, as you start to look at raising the bar means you really need to understand the adversary and how the adversary behaves, because the only way to defend against them really is to understand what they do, why they do it, how they do it. And so one of the things I'll just mention that I'll bring a little bit more during the discussion this morning, one of the things I worked on was something called NASCAR, not the cool NASCAR where you drive around in a circle. NASCAR was really something called NIPRNet, CIPRNet, Cybersecurity Architecture Review. NIPRNet in the DoD terms, it's its unclassified network. CIPRNet is its secret network. And it really was an initiative out of the DoD CIO's office, Mr. Halverson, where he basically called NSA to the carpet and said, look, $2 billion a year plus we're spending on defensive capabilities, not seeing it, right? Breach after breach after breach. And the objective of this effort really was to come back with a new strategy, a new methodology. How are we going to do this? And the reality of what has happened over time was that cybersecurity has been cobbled together, right? An event happens, we buy a product, we deploy a product. Another event happens, we buy another product. We never really did a good job of holistically understanding the adversary and the adversary's behavior. And so this effort really was to capture that, define that, assess current product capabilities against that, and then use that to drive investment strategies. And as we go through the discussion, I'll kind of lean into that a little bit more and give you some more insight into that.
That's terrific. I want to talk about this topic of advanced threats, and it kind of comes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Randy. You talk about sophisticated attackers, and that term gets used and abused maybe some. We talk about advanced threats to mean lots of different things. What do you consider advanced threats? What's that mean to you, and what would you say are your top concerns today? Throw that out to the panel.
Well, I'll start. Being in private practice in a law firm, I see all kinds of clients. Cooley historically has focused on a lot of tech clients, but we've expanded over the years, so we have not just technology companies. And so you see a wide range of understanding and reactions to things. But I think what I find most interesting is how the attack vectors change and how we start to see new things and how the clients react to that. And in particular, how they react to that in the context of sometimes talking with law enforcement. As one particular example, we all know the TJX case with the HVAC vector in. So sort of this indirectness. And we're seeing that now, but in different ways. It's not just through supply chain, which is always a concern, but we're seeing it through the attackers understanding the nuances inside your networks. We have a client who, it's a B2B play. So they don't have any consumer information. They don't deal with consumers directly. They provide services to other companies. And one thing that they do is they have a support function that uses a popular program to basically tunnel in and run remotely their customer's computer. Well, the client got a hold of some credentials that had been compromised of this company, got into the company, realized that these persistent connections were there, used that to launch ransomware on our clients' customers, the enterprise customers. So how many of you out there, this comes to the issue of advanced threats, and have you thought through all the possible ways in, not that you ever could think of all of them, but have you really done a risk assessment with all of your teams, not just the technical folks and the security folks, as to how the attackers might be getting in? Because this to me was one really interesting example of something we hadn't seen before. And when we went and talked to the FBI, I brought in one of my FBI buddies, and they were saying this is an attack that they're starting to see, where the attackers, generally speaking, understand sometimes better than the company itself what their network looks like. They can write and probably have a better network diagram than the company has. And they know those resources and they can exploit them. So I think that's when I hear advanced threats, it's what's on the cutting edge of what the attackers are doing. And then that gets into some of the stuff that these gentlemen deal with.
Yeah, so for me, advanced threats really coming from Mandy and FireEye, where I was before. The way we thought about it was, along the kill chain. There's that open source intelligence gathering where the adversary's, really looking to understand your organization probably better than you know it yourself, and what your people, your skill sets are, technologies that you use. They're looking for an entry point, whether that's a vulnerability or a spear phishing email, or a tunnel that you may have open through a third party that you don't even realize. And then they're looking to, get a foothold in your network, pivot around your network, get access to the data they want, leave something behind or take something away, or deploy ransomware. I guess this has been the trend in the past couple of years. So that's really how I think about it.
Great. Correct.
Yeah, so let me just pick up on a part of this theme, right? Because I could probably take the advanced threats and think about it from a perspective of the DoD and the intelligence community and the type of attackers that you see there versus what you might see within the commercial sector. But the reality is they use a lot of the same techniques. The intent and the objective in the end is somewhat different potentially. But you raise a great kind of point. And I guess over my career, I was always surprised. I could name different agencies, organizations I went to, but the issue of visibility or understanding of their enterprises, I would have thought would have been something that, yeah, we had that nailed. I can tell you even at the NSA, that was not the case, right? And so really understanding our networks and the communication paths. So what are all the assets? What are the critical assets? What are the paths to those assets, critical paths to those assets? So all that gets into kind of an area that within Fidelis we're really working on is visibility. And the idea of visibility says that you can't defend your blind spots, right? So in order to be able to defend your network, you can't have blind spots. You need to understand both your managed and your unmanaged assets that are out there. So that's part of what's going to be critical as you start to look at your current infrastructures and you're looking at the solutions you're deploying. Do you really know where your assets are? Do you know where all these paths are? Because you can't defend them if they're blind to you.
Yeah, you make a good point. Each of you do about the whole visibility issue. The attackers understanding your networks maybe better than you do. I think one thing we found as well, and certainly when we had account takeover issues a few years back, the opponents understand your business processes sometimes better than people in your own organizations. That aside, visibility aside, where do you see the biggest defensive gaps in organizations today, whether they're organizations you deal with yourself or ones that could be clients?
So maybe we'll work backwards this time. Is that okay?
It.
So I'll go to areas that I really see, throughout my career. We talked about visibility. Yep. Visibility is a significant gap. Understanding adversary behavior is a significant gap, and mapping the capabilities that you have to that. Your ability to, as you pointed out, there's, pick your favorite cyber threat framework out there. Whether it's the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's the Lockheed Martin kill chain. I think one of the things that organizations would really benefit from is taking that step back and understanding the capabilities that they've already invested in, right? A lot of investments to date, so I, like any other vendor, will love to come to you and try to sell you a platform, a new capability, but I think the first thing you really want to do is assess what do you have. One of the things that came out of our early analysis was product utilization. Just to give you an idea, DoD cybersecurity stack, 75 plus different vendor products, right? Those products are not integrated, they're not automated, and typically 30% or less utilization of a product. So I think one of the things that's really important is to use the framework, if you will, as a way to have a consistency way to assess capabilities, look at what you have, look at where your gaps are, and then look for vendors that can come to you and explain how do you get that coverage, that 100% coverage. Now here's what 100% coverage means, 100% coverage of known vulnerabilities, known attack techniques. The other important understanding is that that's what we know. There's all the unknown. And so there are ways to start to I'll say, dig into that. And so one of the things at Fidelis that we're doing is we collect metadata on everything that we process across all of that visibility. So having sensors distributed across that enterprise, collecting the metadata, allows us then to run advanced analytics. And those advanced analytics is a way to start to become more proactive and predictive about what adversaries are doing, and really using that to try to gain intelligence on, so where should we be going next? How should we be doing a better job of protecting?
So maybe I would answer the question in two parts. So one, how are we closing that understanding gap? And I think the cloud is really, at least on the server side, clarifying that infrastructure as code. It's all documented. It's all in a single place. You can parse that. You can analyze it. So you're getting rid of all these dark corners of your network. You no longer have physical cables. It all has to be there and it has to be transparent. But the other gap that I see is the endpoint. And I think the traditional endpoint, the Windows, the Mac is being solved, and vendors are out there. They're solving that problem. But we're waking up and there's all these other IoT endpoints, and how do we get visibility into those? How do we understand their behavior? How do we prevent them from being ransomware, from your security cameras running ransomware and Bitcoin mining? You may not even know until the camera breaks because it's overheating. it's located somewhere. And this is a real example. Cameras, overheating because somebody's running, Bitcoin mining on them. But you're not seeing any of these devices with your traditional endpoint. There's some network solutions, but again, so this is the emerging gap that I'm really seeing.
Okay.
I'll start my response with a quick bit of movie trivia. I don't have any prizes or anything, just the accolades. You got the right answer. How many folks know where the following line comes from? It's all about the information, Marty. Sneakers. I heard somebody say it very quietly. So one of my favorite movies, Sneakers, Robert Redford, Sidney Poitier, Dan Aykroyd, River Phoenix, really interesting cast, is, I bring that up in the context of this question and that particular quote because with our clients, Craig talked about knowing what you have from a gear or from a security perspective. We're now seeing a very interesting intersection and a necessary intersection in many ways between the privacy and the security world, and we'll be talking about this in this afternoon's panel, related to where's your data. And I can't help but smile up here hearing some of our responses and thinking, let's see, 11 years ago when I was on the commission, we were having these same conversations and we were talking about these same questions and these same issues, where is your data? It's now becoming much more critical with the compliance aspects of GDPR and CCPA. And I think in terms of the question itself, the biggest gap I see is companies don't know where their data is. And I'm not just talking about personal information. I make that distinction. I'm talking about sensitive data. Yeah, the sexy stuff, the credit card numbers, the PII, all of that's really important. You got to protect that if you're consumer facing and if you have employee data. But it's all of the other stuff, the stuff that General Alexander was quoted as saying, it's the greatest transfer of wealth in history, the transfer of IP to our adversaries because our networks are so porous. And it's because a lot of times you just don't know where your information is. So I think the takeaway for me is, and I'm working on this a lot with my clients, we're doing a data mapping as we speak with a client who I knew the vendor was, I'm smiling on the conference call because I know what the responses are going to be, and the vendor is just going to be like, really? Because the company, my client, is saying, well, we have a very distributed enterprise here. We have a lot of autonomy with our different centers, our different business centers. We don't know what they do. And I almost wanted to say on the call, remember, this call is attorney-client privileged. None of this goes outside of this call. But in all seriousness, if you don't know where your data is, you can have all the gear in the world and it can be tuned properly and you can be looking for your threats. But if you don't know where your data is, you're not going to be able to protect it.
So, Mike, a question for you. We've talked an awful lot up here about enterprises and businesses and how to protect them. Part of your charter is smart cities, and that can include the devices that you're talking about and so many different aspects. When it comes to threat actors, how do we start to protect smart cities?
For sure. So a couple of ways I've been thinking about this problem is one from really the acquisition point. So at the stage where you're going out to buy an IoT device, and New York City, when we buy 10, 15, 50,000, 100,000 of these, whatever the device may be. So before we do that, the contractual kind of stipulations around the minimum requirements, and it's something we've been working on with the Global Cyber Alliance to put together kind of a model framework for IoT cybersecurity purchasing clauses that we can include in contracts ourselves, we can give to all the agencies, we can share with other cities. So when we go to market, we're all going with a uniform voice saying, your device needs to be updatable, it needs to have encryption, it needs to have strong authentication. So that's kind of one way. And another way is really through testing. So I've put together an urban technology IoT cybersecurity lab where we're actually bringing in any of these devices that are being proposed and actually doing threat modeling and hacking these devices and saying what would an attacker, what could they do? And we've done that now about across 12 different devices since we started in earlier this year. And we found some critical vulnerabilities in devices that are actually deployed already in the field by many private corporations, but also by many other cities in critical infrastructure. So we're sharing that information with the DHS and our federal partners. We're sharing it with some of the other cities that are affected. And so we're making sure that we're vetting that. We're doing that currently in a number of upcoming kind of things that'll be on the street, which I can't really talk about, but it's pretty exciting. And then the other way is looking for solutions that can end up monitoring. So we already have 1 million IoT devices that the city's deployed. So how do we instrument, how do we get all the telemetry back into our security operations center so that if a device begins to contact a place that we don't expect it to or behave in an unusual way, we can see that and respond to it and investigate.
Well, the question that comes to mind is with that kind of scale, how do you monitor? How do you patch? how do you mitigate? And the question would be, Craig, for you and Randy as well, with the scale of a city, how do you mitigate the risks?
Yeah, so actually, Mike had brought up several good points. First, I think it starts with almost the security baseline of some of these IoT products. I mean, traditionally, IoT products, it's really opened up the attack vector, the attack surface, right? And so, looking for products that do things like trusted boot, trusted firmware updates, those types of things, looking at mutual authentication. There's a lot of security that needs to be part of the overall design of the IoT products as you're looking to deploy them. But to your question, right, the reality is just because they're designed correctly doesn't mean they're going to be employed correctly. And so there are ways that you can do things like, for example, we have a network product that can actually monitor the traffic and look for and inspect inside, doing deep session inspection, looking actually inside the content of the transactions so what is happening? Is there malware in there? Is there things that have been obfuscated just because what attackers are doing is leveraging the IoT products as essentially an attack vector into certain situations. So there are things that you can do, but again, I think this is where it gets back to, and I think the approach you're taking really is start with the basics, a good security design, a good security architecture, and then put the instrumentation in place to do the monitoring, to do the analysis, to bring back that data. Because that's the other challenge, right? You mentioned 1 million devices. Well, that's 1 million potential alerts, right? So how do you make sense out of that data? And then how do you make it so that it's actionable data, not just alerts are firing, but I think as the keynote was talking about this morning, well, let's just turn down the volume of the alerts, right? We need to essentially be able to make sense of that. So there's analytics that can be overlaid with that to do that.
This is why you're hiring extra people, right?
Exactly. Well, I was gonna point out that I'm usually the first one to bring up contracts. Usually we're having, in these kinds of discussions, mostly a technical and an operational discussion. So thank you for,
I used to work at a law firm.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Well, that's, I mean.
He's got another job for you.
So, we talk about being proactive, but that's not just on the technical side. That's also, as I mentioned, on the operational, but on the legal side as well. Making sure, how many folks in the room deal with their legal teams on a regular basis? Okay. A few years ago, you wouldn't see probably barely half as many hands, maybe even less. So it's good to see that a lot of folks are dealing with your legal teams. You are the folks who understand these risks at a technical perspective, being able to translate that for the legal teams so they can write the contracts the right way. It's a lot different today. It used to be, company would, the technical side of the company would say, we want that service, or we want to do this, or we want to do that, and they'd throw the contract over the wall, and the lawyers would go back and forth, and then they were done. These days, you have to have that interaction because the things we're talking about are much too complex for the legal team to handle by themselves. The risks that we're talking about and how to address them, when you put that into contractual language, you have to do it very carefully and, again, very completely. I think the other thing that comes to mind when you start talking about IoT and the distributed nature of this, we get into 5G, which we probably don't have time to talk about too much. But that changes things quite a bit. And then you also look at from a, what's the best way to describe it? From a response perspective, what are you going to do when you start to see not only the attacks coming in, but the legislation coming in? There's a law in California now that covers IoT devices. Are folks familiar with the California law that goes into effect? Not CCPA. There's a separate IoT law that goes into effect January 1st of 2020. And it requires, again, it's not highly prescriptive. It's basically do good security. But we now have a law on the books saying IoT manufacturers have to produce devices that meet certain requirements. So you can put it in contractually, which I think is great. You have a direct right, or direct way to take action. But you also have now the legislators getting involved. So I think we're seeing things on a proactive side, I would say earlier in the cycle, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. The question is, how effective will these different mechanisms be?
We've got the opportunity here to take some questions as well, and I want to bring people into the discussion here. We're talking about advanced threats and how to raise the bar on cyber defenses. You've got an attorney, a CSO, and a CTO. It sounds like the start of a joke. Attorney, CSO, and CTO walk into the summit. If you've got questions, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you. Right over here. And we've got one over here as well. Good morning.
Thank you. It's a legal question. A big challenge, and you touched on it already, is the lack of technical knowledge that legal teams have. And everything now is a service, SaaS services, and everything is being procured. And it's the triangle between procurement, legal, and IT. So where do you, when you say that legal has to work with your IT departments, is it a governance topic? Is it a risk topic? Because security is a very broad term, and everyone's pointing fingers, well, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to say, I'm not a lawyer, I can't speak to this. And when you work in large enterprises, who within security is who would you go to? Is it a dedicated person who's always there, or is it subjective to what you're ordering?
What's a lawyer's favorite answer to a question like that?
It depends.
It depends, yes. You all have heard that one before. In all seriousness, it does, first of all, it depends on the organization and the structure. But you hit on it, it's a governance issue. I put together years ago sort of a top 10 list, back when boards of directors were starting to get wind of security. Again, partly because of TJX and what happened with the board in that particular case. I put together a top 10. And the number one issue to me is have in place a workable governance structure for your organization. So there probably isn't one answer to your question. It does depend on the organization, but the important thing is that the issues do get addressed. In other words, if you let certain things just sort of pass through, which we've seen, that's where you run into problems. Years ago, as just one example, years ago, we had a number of clients who were grappling with, Joe or Jane just going out and procuring a service with a click wrap and putting it on, a company credit card or just somehow getting it paid for, not because they were trying to open a hole into the environment, they were trying to get their job done. But by doing that, they did open a hole in the environment, or on the back end, there was a lack of recourse. I'm sure I shouldn't say I'm sure. Many of you have probably seen some of these disclaimers in these click wraps, and if your supplier or your service provider drops the ball and it causes a security problem for you, they're off the hook. There's no way, unless you go after them on a negligence claim, which is not contract-based, and it's a very different way and a much higher burden to try and do it from a negligence perspective. But if you have a governance structure in place where you have the people talking to each other, you cut down on that risk significantly.
Got a question right here as well.
Yes, this might be a question for Mike, and Randy might touch on it because of the complexity of contracts. In New York City, there's a history of procurement fraud and corruption with IT procurement.
Should I bring Everett back in?
What are you doing to ensure that what you're deploying is correct and the contracts don't run up? For example, the city time payroll system was supposed to cost tens of millions of dollars. It ended up being hundreds of millions of dollars, and then there were other issues. How do you deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I don't directly deal with it. So my lab services the agencies who actually go out and do the procurement. So when we do the assessment, we're giving them advice, and they're sharing that with their vendors. So ultimately, the decision to procure, this vendor or that vendor rests with the individual agency. So it's not something that I directly deal with.
Craig, I want to bring you into the conversation here and talk a bit about something that Randy brought up, which was supply chain risk. When it comes to visibility especially, we know that vulnerabilities exist in the supply chain. How can they be addressed?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and it's also a real tough challenge. I know, for example, within the DoD, one of the things that the DoD would always do is there would be special procurement of hardware, software, and the like, so that it wasn't known where the particular product was going to be targeted for deployment. And so those are the really tough challenges to say, so how do you address those things? And it is definitely an area that needs to be worked. And it's one of the reasons, additional monitoring is always really good, because you may believe your product is acting or behaving in a certain way. And so you deploy a solution or a solution architecture with that expectation that it's protecting certain things. you backstop that with additional, essentially monitoring, saying, so I essentially set up and configured a product to work a certain way. Is it actually working that way? Or is it not? And if so, then I need to be alerted on that. So there are some things that you can do, but supply chain is definitely an issue. Yes.
And maybe I could add to that. We've actually put some security products through our lab where people have raised an eyebrow, said, it's a mainstream security product. Why would you want to analyze it and pen test it? And we've actually gone and found vulnerabilities in these mainstream security products. So we want to be kind of as holistic as possible before we rely on something to defend the city.
Randy, I know you've got something to say.
Just real quick, on the glass half full side, want to put in a plug for DHS through the CISA organization, not the law. Whoever came up with the same name for an organization as a law, it's in the security spaces, they made things complicated. But anyway, CISA is taking a hard look at supply chain security. And if it is an issue that you need to deal with, follow what they're doing because they're coming up with a framework. They're going to be doing more outreach to the public in terms of how supply chain security should work and the analysis that you should go through.
Terrific. Craig, you had something else you want to add?
Yeah, and I'll just go back to your pen testing point. Again, that's where, when you look at trusted boot and firmware update processes, those are going to be critical for IoT devices to adopt so that you do have a way to manage that product over time and do that management in a secure fashion.
Now, David's got a question over here, and I've got one wrap-up question for you. Let's go here.
Sure. This question sort of applies to things that all three of you had said. Technology manufacturers, producers, suppliers have no onus on their efficacy. It's all pushed out to the customer, right? You can't go after them for negligence. It's too difficult, and the contracts prevent it. Are business outcome-based contracts and purchasing going to be the answer? So they have an economic interest that they don't get paid unless there's an efficacy of the technology or the service in IT security. They don't want to be sued, but do we as the customers have the ability to change the contracting style to say you're going to get paid based on how effective the technology or the services are? Is that the long-term answer?
I mean, I've seen. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say I've seen like one vendor do that, saying if we stop something, you can pay us. Otherwise, we're free. I think it's a novel approach, but it's not tested yet. So let's watch and see.
Yeah, I would liken that to, in the old days, SLAs, service level agreements, but now from a security perspective. I've not seen that frequently, and it's only in sort of specialized situations. But I think it's something to possibly consider to drive the market.
I don't think the vendors are going to offer it ever. I think as customers we have to demand it.
Right.
Well, I think you're right. I'll pick up on that aspect, right? As a product supplier, right? I think you should demand that we provide that level of efficacy in the products that we deliver, right? And I think it's fair for you as to consistently reevaluate the products that you've put in your cybersecurity stacks, right? And so I'll just reinforce the use of a framework to allow you to help think through that decision process, ensure the efficacy of those products, and your contractual agreement should allow you, look, if this product's not working within a year, I should be able to pull that out and plug something else in. I should not be, and I'll tell you the DoD struggled with this. They essentially, the way they purchase products, they were stuck with products, which is the reason they said, well, let me just add something else on top. Let me just add on. They really had no way to extract the product out. And I think there are ways, if you work with the right set of vendors who publish their APIs, who are willing to essentially provide that level of efficacy with their products, there's a way to get there.
Gentlemen, quickly, closing thoughts. How can we raise the bar in cyber defenses? Craig.
For me, it's being more than just reactive. I think traditionally our approaches have been very reactive approaches. I think as you start to look for cybersecurity solutions, look for capabilities that are not only proactive but predictive, and in some cases allow you to be proactive using deception technologies. I think deception technology is something that we really should start to look at because it allows us to change the attack surface. It allows us to really change the game on the adversary and flip it. So it's no longer one path in. If they hit one of, if you will, a decoy type product, that's a high fidelity alert. It's going to allow us as a community to understand, hey, there's something here that's not right. and we should be able to go and essentially remediate it.
Excellent. Mike?
For me, I would say security is a part of information technology, and it should be part of every single project. It has to be built in. You wouldn't buy a car today without airbags and seatbelts. You shouldn't build systems without security. So it absolutely has to be built in, and that'll raise the bar across the board.
Very good. Randy?
Common theme, we've talked about this for years, but prepare, 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 be proactive. But when I talk about that, it's also be proactive on the reactive side. Have your incident response plan in place, pressure test it, do your tabletops, make sure that you're ready for the thing to happen. Remember the old quote from that one of the FBI directors, there's only two types of companies, those that have been breached and those that will find out that they've been breached. I mean, it's known, it's a known fact that there's no such thing as perfect security. If you're ready for the bad thing to happen, you're in a much better position to recover from it.
Excellent. Randy, Mike, Craig, appreciate your time and your insight today. Thank you very much.
Yep.